Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you so much for being with me in our Bible reading plan. As I mentioned previously, we're jumping around a little bit these next 2 or 3 weeks, but there's a method to the madness, so stay with me. Keep reading these chapters as assigned, and eventually I think a picture will come together for you. Today we are in 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1. And, yesterday we looked at the death of King Saul and his son Jonathan and his 2 brothers. Today, King David, he's not yet king, he's David to be king, so to speak, hears the news. And in chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, this is an interesting chapter. There's so many levels to this chapter. So I want to share 2 or 3 things and then share kind of a personal devotional thought from this chapter. One thing I want to share is I want to talk about the question, why did David have the messenger who brought him news of King Saul's death? David had him executed. Why did he do that? Well, think with me for a moment. One, the man who came to David telling him King Saul was dead was a liar. He said he had taken Saul's life at Saul's request, but we know from yesterday's story in Chronicles that Saul committed suicide. In fact, his own armor bearer had refused to kill Saul when the king asked him to do so out of fear of God. And you'll remember that King Saul had chased and hunted David for years, trying to capture and kill him. And there were opportunities when David could have killed King Saul and been freed of having to run and hide, but he would not do it. He would not touch the Lord's anointed. Even though God had rejected Saul as king and chosen David as his successor, in David's heart, it was up to God to remove Saul. He was not going to touch King Saul, kill King Saul, the Lord's anointed. And that word is used in this chapter. The word anointed in our Bibles is the same word for Messiah that often refers to Jesus Christ. In the Old Testament, this word was used to refer to King Saul, King David, the Jewish priest, Old Testament prophets. It were those that God had selected and set apart for a purpose, and so on. And so this man was a liar and had no fear of God. Not really. He was probably looking for a reward. But in claiming to have done what the armor bearer had not done, claiming to have done what David himself refused to do, David saw this man as someone who had no fear of God and was willing to touch the anointed of God, and so he had him executed. Now, a second thing I want to say is in reference to this story and 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 22 says, "Do not touch my anointed ones," plural, and do my prophets no harm. So the anointed ones are associated with the prophets as well as others, as I mentioned. And God says in Chronicles, do not touch them, do them no harm. Some preachers use these verses. I think they misuse them. Some preachers use these verses as a way of browbeating or intimidating God's people into never questioning them, never criticizing them, never disagreeing with them. You're not to touch God's anointed. And they abuse that verse. Now, it is true, according to New Testament teaching, that church members need to be very careful when it comes to talking about and criticizing preachers, pastors, talking about them to others. They are God's consecrated. They are God's called. So be very, very careful. In fact, New Testament speaks about that quite a bit. But yet pastors are also to be, and preachers, above reproach, and they are to be accountable, not to be money hungry, not to be abusive or arrogant or dishonest, unbiblical, materialistic, unwilling to show respect and listen to others. And church members don't have to agree with the preacher on everything. And if he does something really wrong, they have a right to call him out on that. Now, how you go about it really does matter. And historically, a lot of church members have not done that properly. But yet it's also true that some preachers take that verse about not touching God's anointing, and they just abuse it and use it like a sledgehammer on people and say, you have to agree with me. Don't touch God's anointed. And that is not what that passage is teaching. Disagreement should be handled with kindness and respect, at times even deference, but not with blind agreement. Third thing I want to talk about is David's grief. Now think about this. David had been running and hiding from King Saul, who was jealous of him and wanted to kill him. And yet when David got the news that Saul had died and Jonathan and his brothers had died, David genuinely grieved. Look at verse 11 of chapter 1, 2 Samuel. David took hold of his clothes and he tore them. And so also did all the men who were with him, because in their culture, tearing your clothes, putting ashes or dust on your head, all of that was a symbol of mourning. It could be because of very deeply felt grief over something bad that had happened, or it could be grief over sin that you're repenting of. And so David is expressing tremendous grief. Verse 12, they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan and the people that had fallen by the sword. So there's this grief. And then starting at verses 19 on, we have David, he writes this dirge, this song of lament to remember King Saul by. And it's interesting that in verse 20, he did not want Israel's enemies rejoicing over the news that King Saul had been defeated and died. In verse 23, he actually says positive things about Saul. The very man who was trying to kill him, who was jealous of him, said positive things about him. And in verse 24, he encouraged the whole nation of Israel to mourn Saul's death. Now think about that in the context of Saul trying to kill David. Wow. You get a little insight here into what the Bible means when it says David was a man after God's own heart. Was David a perfect man? Absolutely not. His sins were grave at times, but he had a sense of what God's heart was like, and he demonstrates it here. Jesus talked about loving your enemies, praying for those who misuse you and abuse you, blessing those who harm you, persecute you. Look at how David treated Saul. Refused to kill him when he had the opportunities. Mourned over his death even though Saul wanted David dead. And there's lessons in all of this for us. None of us are perfect, but a heart that is like the heart of God has compassion. And think about us, think about America, think about politics, think about so much that goes on in our culture today. Why is it that so many in our culture want to treat anyone who disagrees with them like they're demonic? Why is that? Why is it that in our culture we think it's okay for Christians to look at people who are our enemies? And believe me, as people of faith, people of Jesus, people of the Word of God, we have enemies. And we are not to, let them destroy us or the country. But why is it we allow our hearts to become so corrupted that we look at them with hate? And while many would deny and say, no, I don't hate them, the truth is I think some of us sometimes do hate them. We just don't want to admit it. Because when you demonize someone and you dehumanize someone, that's just a short step from hating someone. So while we stand for the truth, we teach the truth, speak the truth, live the truth, vote the truth, part of the truth is not allowing our enemies to corrupt our spirit. And I think David is a good example of keeping his heart in touch with the heart of God when people were trying to undo him. I think there's a lesson. There's a lesson for us in how David acted. And I wish everybody in our culture could learn that lesson. We'd be in a much better place if we could. Besides, you're never going to serve someone, probably not going to pray very much for someone, be effectively witnessing to someone that you hate. I want us to mourn more than we do and hate a lot less than we do. I'll see you tomorrow as we skip around again, and we will be in 1 Samuel chapter 13. God bless you, everybody.